By way of quick introduction, I run the telecoms and digital infrastructure group across the global firm. Before becoming a lawyer, I worked for IBM in their AS400 department, but I've been doing telecoms infrastructure stuff for about 25 years. And so the first question is actually, why is a telecoms lawyer talking to you about switching of cloud infrastructure services? And the reason is that at the EU level, the EU is particularly concerned about hyperscalers. So the cloud infrastructure services market, so every corporate who gets their cloud hosting quite often will use either S3 or EC2 if they're an AWS account, or Google Cloud Platform, or Microsoft Azure. So about 90% of the EU's cloud infrastructure services are using those hyperscalers, and they have one thing in common that the EU is slightly concerned about, and that's that they're all American companies at heart. And so at an EU level, the challenge is, how do we encourage UK and EU businesses to develop cloud infrastructure services companies? And one of the reasons that the Commission and Ofcom and the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK is concerned is not just the sort of near dominance in the cloud infrastructure services market, but all of the downstream advantages that that gives to AWS, Microsoft and Google in terms of services that build on those building blocks, if you like. And so we've actually written a paper about this, so if you're interested, just get in touch with the organisers, because we've covered both the EU Data Act and obviously, unfortunately, depending on your point of view, we're outside the European Union now, so the UK has done its own thing and launched a market investigation into cloud infrastructure services providers in the UK. I've got a slightly different set of slides than I would otherwise have presented, but thanks, Nick, to giving me any slides at all. One of the things that the Commission and in fact Ofcom and the CMA are looking at is withdrawal of switching charges. So we've all got a mobile phone, and you may or may not know from like 3 or 4 years ago, you've got the right to switch free of charge after your minimum period has expired. And what the EU has done is to say, well, actually, we're going to use that same toolkit and phase out switching charges. So if you're on an AWS product and you want to move your data onto a different cloud infrastructure provider's product, they want to completely outlaw switching charges. Currently, it's free to you if you're a corporate. Whenever you're transferring data in to the cloud, to the likes of AWS, it's free. There's no charges made at all. Actually, when you transfer your data out, then there are charges depending on which AWS region or AWS availability zone you're in. And so that is effectively a type of competitive constraint, because once you're on a free tier AWS offering, there is a cost associated to you moving to another provider. So it's seen as being a massive impediment. So Article 29 of the EU Data Act, which is now in force but will need to be implemented in member states, basically outlaws what are called egress charges from 2027. And from now, you can only charge the cost associated with actually transferring the data. So that's a massive step forward, I think, in terms of ensuring the cloud infrastructure services market is more competitive. The tricky thing is, though, that if you look at how all of the providers have done this, they've immediately posted policies that says actually the cost of data transfer is free. So from a publicity perspective, it looks amazing. What isn't so good is actually if you've got a multi-cloud offering, and let's say you want to use EC2, an AWS product for your hosting, but another provider for a service that you're loading on top of that, that free transfer of data no longer applies, or at least it's not within their published statements. So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of regulation. And what you would generally find is regulation lags technology by at least 5 years. But at least it's a step forward in terms of what the EU is doing. In many ways, the more positive aspects are some of the softer obligations they're going to put on all cloud infrastructure services providers. So one of the issues that's been highlighted, certainly by the CMA, is that there are quite subtle, nuanced ways of disincentivize someone from switching from your product. So for example, if you've got to rewrite some of your code before you switch from, I'll use someone else, Google Cloud Platform to AWS, then that is a big disincentive for you to switch. And so now what they're saying is you've got to make open interfaces available to customers in order to make switching a lot easier, and use common specifications which the EU are in the process of developing. Although those, don't want to get too optimistic, but those tend to take quite a long time. If you look at something like open banking, actually developing those APIs, a common set of APIs, took quite a long time. So the responses of the hyperscalers are in these links here, but in summary, it's an all or nothing approach, i.e. if you want to switch all of your data off Google Cloud Platform going onto Azure, then it's free. But actually, if you only want to move some of your services, you want to do a pick and mix and a best of breed, then there's more likely to be a cost associated with that. And then, how am I doing for time, actually? Because
5 minutes.
Okay. These are more complex slides than I had actually intended to present. But if you look here, this clarifies, these are all on the AWS platform. So in transferring into AWS is completely free, but the costs of transferring out depends on what region you're in. So in summary, AWS has got, I think, 38 different geographical regions and 3 in the pipeline, including a region that is geo-fenced to the EU. And that's basically to deal with some of the data localization issues that certain providers have. They don't want a company that's controlled by the US state to have access in their own minds to these data sets. So geolocalization is a part of the AWS portfolio. You do get a free tier of data transfer, so up to 100 gigabytes of data transfer out per month. That is completely global. So actually, if you're a massive corporate, then that would not necessarily touch the service if you wanted to switch all of your platform onto a different provider. And then it gets more complicated if you're switching between AWS regions. The pricing for AWS is different depending on which region you're in. So Singapore is incredibly expensive, whereas I think North Carolina is much cheaper, and that's just the cost of living factor that you need to take into account. So if you're doing a testing environment, you would use an AWS region in North Carolina. And then you can pay both for inward transfers and outward transfers if you're switching between availability zones, but that is it's beyond the comprehension, I think, of both speaker and maybe audience, but definitely speaker. But availability zones are broadly about 100 kilometres apart. And so if you want to build in redundancy to your service, then you would allocate various instances of the software in different availability zones because they're not on the same floodplain and they're not in the same, they wouldn't be subject to, say, an earthquake, wouldn't take out both availability zones in a particular region. And this pretty much summarizes, I think, how AWS regions and availability zones work. So if you're switching between RDS, which is a relational database service that Amazon has got, between availability zones, there's no data transfer, but actually, and none within an availability zone between RDS and the EC2 instances. But actually, if you are switching between EC2 instances, there are, or from an RDS instance to an EC2 instance in a different availability zone, there are data transfer charges. This particular set of slides was for a consulting division, so it's probably in a bit more detail than I might have imagined. So hopefully that was broadly comprehensible. And if anyone's got any questions, then I'm far away. Sure.
So when you're talking about these exit charges, right?
Yeah.
That's mostly comprised of IP transit egress, right?
Yeah.
So if you're mostly there we go. So if you're mostly talking about the IP transit costs, and we get rid of that completely, there are smaller hosting providers in Europe and in the UK whose business model actually relies on those fees, because in order to be competitive on the hardware, they actually have to be slightly more expensive on IP transit costs. So essentially, in order to make it easier for people to transfer away from hyperscalers, it sounds like you're potentially damaging or trashing entirely the business models of smaller hosting providers.
Yeah, because actually one way of architecting your solution is to use something like Console Connect, and that will make the data transfer sort of cheaper. But you're right, that is what's called the law of unintended consequences. So that this is a massive macro issue for a succession of European Union commissioners. They're not necessarily looking downstream at the impact on alternative players in the ecosystem. We haven't developed anyone who can compete with AWS or GCP or Microsoft Azure. What are we going to do about it? So what I would say is, yeah, that's entirely possible, and maybe not factored into their thinking. I would also say that I think I've got my misgivings about the EU Data Act, and I suspect what will happen is there'll be another set of competition infringement proceedings against the hyperscalers at some point down the line.
Yeah, it sounds like they need to actually talk to smaller providers in Europe that want to grow and potentially compete, rather than just thinking in their little ivory towers.
Yeah, it's quite tough for that part of the market, because as interest rates have gone up, the amount of funding for smaller fibre providers, we act for a lot, is quite a challenging environment, particularly if they're regional only. That can be quite challenging. We've got 1 minute left, so maybe one more question.
Any final brief questions? If not, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And thanks to Nick.